This is Zain. Today the topic of our show is, why is the US in Syria? Today the guest of our show is Alex Christoforou, the editor and the director of The Duran, theduran.com. Welcome to our show, Alex. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Great to be here.
Alex, let's get to the first question. What is the U.S. claim to get into Syria? And in your opinion, do you agree with their claim, or is there another reason?
Well, let's start from a very basic fact. The U.S. is in Syria illegally. They were not invited to enter the country by the internationally recognized government of Syria in Damascus, the Assad government. So they were never invited. So right off the bat, you have an illegal invasion and occupation of Syrian territory. This is very much unlike Russia, which was invited under international law by the Damascus government to intervene in the Syrian conflict. So you start with the fact that that the United States, is in Syria illegally. Now, the United States says that they're in Syria to fight ISIS, as well as Iraq. So they're in Iraq and Syria to fight ISIS. The interesting part about this, starting from the Obama years and all the way to now Trump's White House, is that the United States has been playing a very duplicitous game. On the one side, they're stating that they're in Syria and Iraq to fight ISIS. But in Syria especially, the United States has been providing ISIS with training, funding, arms, etc. So on the one side, they're claiming to fight ISIS. In Iraq, they probably are fighting ISIS to a certain extent. In Syria, they're actually funding and supporting ISIS. The end goal, of course, has always been regime change, to remove Assad from power in Damascus.
Alex, who are the U.S. fighting in Syria?
Well, it's extremely confusing. And it's been confusing since Obama started this Syrian intervention campaign, and it's confusing for the Trump White House, which to this day I don't think they've expressed a clear and cohesive policy on Syria. There's no doubt that Obama's policy in regards to Syria and Iraq was one big mess. It was extremely confusing, and now that the war is even winding down, and there's no doubt about it that Assad has won, and the Syrian Republic has won the war against ISIS, that there's still a lot of unanswered questions as to how all the powers that are involved in this area are going to deal with the fallout of this 6-7 year long crisis. But the United States, from the beginning, under Obama's White House, they created this fictitious term, this marketing term called the moderate rebel. And we can say the word over and over again, and we can see how ridiculous of a term that is. It's a pure Hollywood, script writing, marketing, propaganda ploy, a moderate rebel. The hell is a moderate rebel? For Obama and the liberal left mainstream media, they push this moderate rebel narrative as some sort of freedom fighter in Syria looking to liberate the country from the clutches of this evil dictator. I mean, we've seen this script play out over and over again. We've seen it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and there's always been this narrative that democracy is going to win the day, and it's going to spring up from the ground and flourish, and nothing has ever been further from the truth. So you have this moderate rebel narrative, and you have all these different groups, jihadist groups in Syria that have essentially invaded the country. And the U.S., along with its quote-unquote coalition partners, have been funding and arming these moderate rebels. And the funny thing is that these moderate rebels are, sometimes they're ISIS, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're fighting with ISIS, other times they're not. But the arms are coming to these rebels, and these arms are essentially moving from these rebels to ISIS. And so, we've got many documented cases of the U.S. government at many times fighting against the Syrian army, the legitimate, internationally recognized Syrian army, in order to protect these moderate rebels, aka ISIS. And we've seen it at Deir ez-Zor, where the Syrian army was pushing back against ISIS and these quote-unquote moderate rebel groups, and the U.S. Air Force, under what is thought to be a CIA command, actually bombed the Syrian army in order to strengthen the position of ISIS in Syria. So we've seen many cases of U.S. Support for ISIS, sometimes in the form of supporting the moderate rebels, and then that support moves towards the ISIS fighters, and sometimes even directly going towards ISIS fighters themselves in Syria. Either way, it's an extremely confusing position for the U.S. to maintain, and we're seeing that this confusing position that the U.S. has taken in Syria has led to the U.S. losing a lot of power and influence within the Middle East.
How long has the U.S. been in Syria, and what have they achieved?
Look, they've been in Syria from day one. They've been in Syria either by supporting these proxy armies, ISIS and these al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, or any other jihadist groups within Syria that purposefully came into Syria in order to promote this regime change initiative. And so this has been happening since day one. What we've seen in Syria was never a civil war. There was no civil war, even though that's been the narrative pushed by the mainstream media. This was, without a doubt, a regime change policy. This was an invasion. It was an invasion by jihadist terrorist groups. Call them what you want. Call them Al-Qaeda, call them al-Nusra, call them moderate rebels, call them ISIS. At the end of the day, they were all in Syria with the explicit purpose of removing Assad and eventually raising a black flag in Damascus, which would have been a complete disaster. So the U.S. has been involved in this conflict from day one. The U.S. military has over time carved out a presence in Syria, as they also have a very large footprint in Iraq. And we don't really know how many bases or how many troops the U.S. currently has in Syria. We've heard reports of anywhere from 8 bases to 12 bases which are operating in Syria. And the big question is, now that Assad, with the help of Russia and Iran, have defeated ISIS, and they have defeated ISIS, and you never hear this in the mainstream media. You hear, Trump, to his, marketing prowess and his marketing genius, is working to take the credit for defeating ISIS, which is nothing further from the truth. That credit falls first and foremost with the Syrian army, the internationally recognized Syrian army that defeated ISIS, those men on the ground that fought ISIS for so many years. And then you look at the Russian support and the Iranian support, which was a real game changer when Russia entered the conflict. Everything shifted, and you saw Assad starting to win and starting to take back territory and solidify his position and his legitimacy. So the U.S. presence in Syria is not known, but what is known is that now that Assad has essentially eradicated ISIS and has pushed them out of Syria, we have all these forces from Turkey to the U.S. to Saudi Arabia to Iran to Russia, the Kurds in the north. All these entities are now trying to figure out what's next. And this is where you see all the powers kind of jockeying for leverage as to who's going to control what in Syria. That's the complicated part of it. And the U.S. has stated that they want to leave their troops in Syria once again in order to not let ISIS regain a foothold. Now, the truth of the matter is that if the U.S. does leave a military presence in Syria, and Russia, Iran, and their support pulls out, you will undoubtedly see that regime change policy jump right back into motion, gear back into motion. So, Russia has explicitly stated that they will not accept a U.S. military footprint and presence in Syria. You also have the Kurds in the north and Turkey, which is a whole nother separate tension point, where you have Erdogan and the Turks, who will never accept the Kurds carving out a space in northern Syria and northern Iraq. So this is a whole nother area of tension now that the Syrian ISIS conflict has winded down and Assad is definitely here to stay. We're looking at who's going to control what in Syria, and you're looking at the U.S. definitely trying to leverage for some sort of military foothold within Syria. And this is extremely dangerous and extremely foolish. And once again, to get back to a very simplistic point on international law, the U.S. has zero right under international law to have any sort of presence in Syria because they were never invited by the internationally recognized government of Syria. And you never hear this mentioned in the mainstream media. You never hear them call out the legality of what the U.S. is doing in Syria. Why are they there? They were not invited. They are there illegally. They're breaking international law. And this is a very simple and simplistic way of looking at the U.S. presence in Syria, but it's a legal way of looking at the U.S. in Syria and their presence. And we have to get back to international law and understand that all countries should be held accountable to the standards of international law.
Alex, quickly, let's get to the last question. How long do you think the U.S. will be staying in Syria, and how do you see the end of the Syrian war, especially when China is sending its special forces into Syria?
Yeah, this is a big development. China has always backed Assad, but they've always backed him in a very quiet, low-key kind of way. And this is actually a very overt signal to the international community that now that Assad has solidified his control in Damascus and in Syria, China is fully backing Assad. And so once again, you see a tectonic shift in international power. And that shift is once again moving towards a Russia, China, Iran axis of power. And China moving their special elite forces into Syria is testament to the fact that of Assad's control of the situation now and him winning the war. So China is obviously sending a message that they respect now the sovereignty of Syria. They respect the fact that Assad is the legitimate leader of Syria, and they're going to provide any support that Assad needs in order to wipe out whatever remaining facets of ISIS are in the country. As for how long the U.S. is going to stay in Syria is I think a big question mark. No one can really know. What is known is that Russia and Iran and China and of course most importantly Syria are not going to allow or do not want to allow the U.S. to remain within Syrian borders because the consequences could just lead to a whole nother conflict and a whole nother war. If you have the U.S. military in Syria, it's not far-fetched to envision Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey once again leveraging the U.S. presence to start another conflict to ultimately overthrow the regime, the Assad regime, which was the goal from the very beginning 6-7 years ago. So a U.S. footprint in Syria is very dangerous. Picture the scenario of if the U.S. somehow manages to stay within Syria and Russia pulls out. All of a sudden, you have a de facto no-fly zone within the region. In other words, you have the U.S. and with an extension NATO, because Turkey is also a NATO country. You have a very strong element of U.S. air power within the region. You remove the Russian Air Force, and all that you're left with is the U.S. Air Force, and to the north, the Turkish Air Force. And there you're looking at a very dangerous situation for the Assad government and for Syria. You're not giving the Syrian people a chance to rebuild their country and to get on with their lives and to establish some sort of normalcy after 6-7 years of brutal, devastating fighting. And so how long the U.S. stays is is anyone's question. You know, if you ask Russia, Iran, or China, and especially Syria, they're screaming and they tell you the U.S. has to get out now. Unfortunately, Mattis and the generals of the Trump administration are trying to leverage the spoils of war, and they're trying to keep up presence in Syria, knowing that an opportunity will come for them to reignite another go at Assad. And so this is the dangerous aspect of what's happening. You have all kinds of tension already in the area between the Turks and the Kurds. You're seeing it between Israel, Iran, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. The last thing you need is a U.S. Military presence within Syria's borders. That's not going to help the situation whatsoever.
Thank you so much, Alex Christoforou, for being on Tactical Talk. It's always a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
This was Alex Christoforou, the editor and the director of The Duran, theduran.com. We were discussing why is the U.S. in Syria. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain. Take care and goodbye.